Hello and welcome. Clinical trials are a huge opportunity but also have huge social and economic impact and outcome. Less than 2% of global clinical trials are being conducted in India, and that tells you a lot about the opportunity ahead. But to understand what are the hindrances perhaps in achieving this opportunity, I'm joined by Krishnakumar Sankranarayanan, Associate Director, Pharmaceutical, Life Sciences and Medical Devices Consulting at PWC. Thank you very much, Krishnakumar, for speaking to us.
Thank you.
2% is happening in India. Where's the other 98% happening?
I think predominantly the remaining trials usually happen. The United States, for example, has about 50% of the world's trials. Countries like
it's a myth that all the clinical trials are happening in developing countries or emerging markets.
That's right. It is a myth, and if you look at the global database of clinical trials, which is maintained by the Clinical Trials Registry (FDA), they actually show you the fact that the developed countries still have the predominant other places where the trials are predominantly held. In India, in Asia, for example, the maximum number of trials happens in South Korea, which is amongst the most advanced of countries. So I think it's something which probably that's part of the education process that one needs to let's say demythicize.
Okay, so what's the size of this opportunity, and then we'll come to what are the specific problems?
So I think before the current set of concerns came up, I think India was looking at the clinical trials industry was about $500 million, and industry estimates was likely to go up to $1 billion in 2015. So yes, in terms of the potential that it had, not just in economic terms, but also to create new therapies which are relevant for the Indian context. I think 2% of trials is one metric. Another important metric is that we have 20% of the world's disease burden.
Right.
So the mismatch between the disease burden and the percentage of trials which happen in India, I think that is something.
So you're saying obviously there is a certain percentage of trials, therefore, which must happen in a country like India so as to find solutions for the problems in India.
And some of these could also be trials which are generated by Indian companies, because some of the problems that we have are very unique to India, and therefore to make sure that there's a meaningful market which can be addressed by companies. I think apart from the global trials which happen in India, I think there's also need for India specific solutions.
Right. So there is now a lot of concern about the way clinical trials are administered. Is that because, we'll come to the regulations in a moment, is that because of the manner they've been administered or the companies that have been administering it, or some fallout thereof?
No, I think in the period from, let's say, 2005 to 10, when the Drugs and Cosmetics Act was amended and there was a growth in...
And that's the act that governs clinical trials.
That's right. So the number of trials went up, but the regulatory apparatus to administer the trials did not rise in commensurate terms, which meant that there was a lot of gray areas, and lack of oversight obviously led to a sequence of problems. It became almost like a vicious cycle, that you start with imbalance between regulation and enforcement on the ground, leading to more, let's say, some instances of bad trials, media reports, activism, and then court. So it became almost like a vicious cycle. But to be fair to the government, I think they have also been engaging with the industry to try and address this problem even before the observations from the court had come about.
Right. So there are two issues we could perhaps focus on, which seem to be the key concern areas as well. So one is to do with compensation guidelines, and the second is to do with medical management of clinical trials, or medical management of those who volunteer for clinical trials.
That's right.
So of these two, which is the most of greater concern?
No, I think both are concerns in their equal measure, because on the medical management side, because the concern is that if you're enrolled in a trial, then you automatically qualify for medical management, irrespective of whether the problem that you suffer is related to the trial or not. So in a way, it kind of becomes like free healthcare to that particular person.
And this is not the case in other markets?
Not in the case in the US, for instance? In the US, for example, even if it is a clinical trial related event, even then compensation is not mandatory, because the argument there is a patient actually enrolls in a trial knowing fully well, what are the risks and benefits.
So this is an hindrance for the companies that are doing the business, right?
That's right.
Okay. But
and it is also, there are a lot of research in India also happens which are investigator-led research, which don't have an industry sponsor, which is a hospital, which may be a public hospital, which may be doing a trial of its own. So it's not a problem only for industry, it's a problem for academic centers.
So let me get a quick sense. I should have maybe asked you this earlier. What's the split? How much of clinical trial business, or how is the clinical trial business in India split between players, and what kind of players?
No, I think if you look at industry versus academic trials, I think the industry-led trials obviously are higher in terms of number of trials. But if you look at the number of patients, the investigator-led trials usually have a higher patient enrollment. Okay. So there is a dichotomous situation there, and therefore both need to be addressed.
Right. So let's come back to the medical management. So you're saying that that's one concern, because patients with prior conditions get eligible for resolving those prior conditions as well.
Or if they or in case of events which, for example, a traffic accident, or you have a fall at home, things, all that kind of gets covered. So I think the industry expectation is that if it is proven to be related to the trial, then it is the ethical responsibility of the sponsor to make sure that the patient is managed for that condition.
Right. So that's one. The second is to do with compensation.
That's right.
And what's the bug?
Yeah. So there, I think there are two categories under which compensation gets paid, which I think is an area of concern. The first is if the drug that the clinical trial is for fails to act. I think that is a hastily drafted legislation, in my opinion, because the very purpose of doing a trial is to see whether a drug is effective or not. So if the drug fails to deliver its benefit, that by itself doesn't become a reason for payment of compensation. The second is in terms of what is called as a placebo, which is a sham pill that you give to compare the effectiveness. So if you are in the placebo arm of a placebo-controlled trial, then you again become eligible for compensation. So I think these two are.
So this is compensation beyond what you would have got paid otherwise?
Yeah, otherwise there is usually, it's just reimbursement of expenses, and there is medical management. So there is reimbursement of your actual expenditure. There is the medical management, and these compensation is over and above the medical management.
This is assuming or aim towards something that goes wrong?
That goes wrong,
okay.
Either in the form of an adverse event, which means that the patient has had a problem and he needs to be, or in worst cases, in case of a death,
okay.
In which case the next of kin gets the compensation.
Okay. So you said these are the two key issues. You've given us a sense on what the size and opportunity is. 2%, 98%, 50% in the US alone, that could potentially come here. So if you're saying that we could have gone to $1 billion, I'm assuming the market opportunity as a whole is maybe $50 billion upwards as a.
No, I think in terms of the global size, yes, it is a fairly large industry, and I think the search for new therapies, etc., continues as newer diseases get discovered, and more effective treatments, and in the context of India, more cost-effective treatments, etc. So I think there's a whole host of reasons why clinical trials, ought to be done. And also, if we look at India, we are talking about India being like a knowledge hub and being, knowledge-based industries driving India's growth. I think clinical trials, research and development, I think is an integral part of that positioning that India aspires for. And I think an early resolution to this, I think, would be helpful there as well.
Right, Krishnakumar. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much.